Welcome to Crucial Conversations for Radical Educators. I am Dr. Emily Bautista, and I am presenting at the fourth Biennial Equity Ingenuity Conference 2026 on February 28, 2026. My session is titled The Equity of Ethnic Studies, and I am here today to give you a little snippet of what you can expect at the conference. So I'm going to start off with sharing about my just sharing about my family and how that brought me to where I am. So I'm gonna get to sharing my screen. All right. So this work really starts off with my family that came here to the United States. This is my Uncle Max. He came here when he was 16 and he like many immigrants came to the United States with a dream, and he worked in the fields in the Central Valley and the canneries in Alaska, and just kind of made that circular loop. And I didn't really know much about it when I went to when he had his funeral. People were talking about how he was a pioneer, and I was in high school at the time, and I was like, okay, like big deal. Like he was an immigrant, like not big deal, but more like, okay, like yeah, that's okay. That's like a very common story. But it didn't it was I got into UCLA, and I was really fortunate to be a part of these programs that really help students of color. And so I was in a student organization called Samahang Pilipino, and they were helping us try to learn more about who we were, right? We go to college, but for what purpose? And when I was when I was in the organization, they would do these trips to Delano, and they talked about these monongs. And this is actually me, my first year in college, in the audience, listening to a monong, which means in my family's language in Ilocano, it means older brother. And this was a monong talking about his journey. And this was my first year in college, so right after the year after my uncle passed away. And I was I had so many emotions when I learned about all the all the barriers that they encountered just to get to this country, um, and the working conditions. I had no idea. And I felt so heartbroken that I never got to appreciate my uncle's experience and what that did for my family to be able, for my dad's family to come to this country. And I just felt this huge grief and sadness and pain that here I am in this country, just going through the motions, just going to school, trying to get a college degree, and not even realizing like what it really means to understand who your people are and what they've gone through. And so this was really the breakthrough for me when learning about ethnic studies and what that means for communities of color in this country. And so that was my opening, and that's the beginning of my own arc, my own story. And here I wanted to share, why does this matter in education when we are serving communities that are marginalized, that have experienced all kinds of challenges. And so I wanted to introduce this idea that Professor Alison Tintiango Cubales and her colleagues have talked about, where there is something called the arc of ethnic studies. And I think this is really important for people and educators and school leaders and district leaders to understand that ethnic studies isn't just about like, oh yeah, we're gonna make sure that people of color are represented in history curriculum or even in literature. in the things that we read in our schools. It's much deeper than that. And the story of ethnic studies really comes from this long fight for where students like me that went to college and really yearned to understand like what is this, what is a purpose? What is the meaning of learning? And what can that do? Is it for just for me? What is it for? And so ARC stands for A is access. Students of color being able to have access into colleges, into universities, being able to actually access these institutions where there is an opportunity to really learn. And so for me, that was when I got into UCLA and was really able to really be fortunate to have access to programs that were and organizations that were focused on this on the experiences of students of color. The R stands for relevance. And so relevance really stands for how is this relevant to our own lived experiences, right? Why should I care about the experiences or what I'm learning if it has nothing to do with me, right? And so now understanding the impact of our cultural and historical and ethnic experiences was really important for me to see that, oh, okay, like this actually, like it's actually worthy of study. This isn't just something that happened to my family. This is actually, there's generations of people that are experiencing these things. And in turn, it impacts community, the C of ARC. And so with ethnic studies, it's about one, advocating for students to have access to these institutions. And then once they get there, being able to have curriculum and learning experiences that are actually relevant to us, right? And then from there, what do we do with that? Well, hopefully now we're able to take what we've been learning and think about how we can bring it back to our communities because we don't just advance as individuals, we advance as a community. And so that's really the heart and the spirit of ethnic studies. And so something that I really hope that folks leave with this presentation is the concept that ethnic studies isn't just content. It is a pedagogy. There is a whole spirit to it and how it gets delivered. And so I really like to ground myself in essential questions. So the essential questions here that I want to focus on is why does ethnic studies matter? And what are the implications for K-12 educators? And so I really wanted to start with Christine Sleeter's work and here just to really raise this idea that the result of continuing to minimize attention to racism and white complicity is that students perceive racism as a tragedy of the past, divorced from other historical issues. That was what I was feeling. That's what I was realizing when my first year in college, in that trip to Delano, realizing like, oh wow, I was just thinking that was a tragedy, but I didn't realize that this is historical. And then continuing with Christine Sleeter, the contemporary realities of power in American society. So when textbook authors bury the history of American racism within a larger narrative of inevitable American progress, students perceive race relations as a linear trajectory of improvement rather than a messy and continual struggle over power that encompasses both progress and racial justice. And so that's what it became for me. Once I started to realize, okay, this wasn't just my family's story and like a lot of other immigrant family stories. No, there's a whole history of these different relations. And it's not just about this is what we have to go through just to have progress. No, there's actually a whole struggle over power. And so once I started to understand that as someone who is learning these concepts and ideas through these ethnic studies experiences, both in the classroom and in the community, that's what I started to realize was an injustice. And this is when I started to understand that something needs to change because why did I have to get into UCLA, one of the hardest, most applied to universities in this country, to learn this about myself, right? And so mainstream Euro-American education denies all students an education that takes seriously institutional racism that people of color experience every day and how it affects everyone. And it fails to take knowledge, this education seriously, that knowledge, the knowledge from communities of color. And also it denies all students to be able to be equipped with tools to navigate a racially hostile system and to be able to have a vision to address it. Okay. And so with that, we're not just gonna be frustrated, we're going to do something about it. So ethnic studies grew from this desire to counterbalance both the inaccuracies and the predominance of Euro-American perspectives that underlie our mainstream curricula. And because of this bias, mainstream curricula contribute to the academic disengagement of students of color. So again, it's like when these biases and these ideas is just the mainstream, that's why we see a lot of times students of color are disengaged because it's not relevant. So ethnic studies can reverse that disengagement, as Sleater talks about. So really the objectives of ethnic studies is to rehumanize the world by dismantling institutional racism and hegemonic structure that really comes from Black studies. Ethnic studies reorganizes and produces knowledge and research processes around questions that are central to the well-being of communities of color. And that comes from Chicano studies. And ethnic studies is about decolonization, empowerment, and sovereignty. And that comes from American Indian studies. And so earlier I talked about, so that's the justice piece. But now what's the how? How do we do this? And so as Dintiango, Cubales, Coley, Sacramento, Henning, and Agarwal, and Ragnathan, and Sleater, they say that it is not enough to adopt an ethnic studies curriculum without attending to pedagogy. Ethnic studies pedagogy must be rigorous, culturally and community responsive, and reflective to be effective in living its promise of decolonization and challenging racism. That is so key because a lot of times what I've been seeing is okay, this person has a social studies degree, this person has an ELA credential, right? Let's just give them the ethnic studies classes. That is not really setting us up to the spirit of ethnic studies. There is a whole pedagogy to it, right? And so with that, what does that look like? We we need to engage with the purpose of ethnic studies. It is to address racism through critique, resistance, and transforming systems of oppression. It's about building knowledge about students' own contexts and what they go through and how it impacts the way that they're positioned in this world and the way they think about why things are the way they are. And while we're doing that, and this is so important, the importance of building family and community relationships. So what you see sometimes is when we have we we focus on okay, you got to succeed in your mainstream schooling. Well, with that is embedded with these Euro perspective biases, right? Euro American biases. And so a lot of times when students of color don't want to distance themselves from their family and their communities, that's when we see that disengagement. That's when we see that resistance to excelling in these mainstream Euro American perspective, these schooling environments that are grounded in that. And so ethnic studies is about like, well, how can we also build what is about your community's knowledge and be able to still maintain those relationships? That's so key. Also, our curriculum needs to be rigorous, right? There's a lot of times there's these misconceptions that ethnic studies is easy. No, it's rigorous and it provides that challenge, and it's also responsive to the students' experiences. And it incorporates practices and methods that are responsive to community needs and and community challenges and problems, right? So what's the purpose of this learning? Well, it's because we see this happening in our community every day, but we don't have to accept it. We can actually do something with it. We can use the knowledge that we are learning across different disciplines. We can apply that knowledge to address this community concern. And then as a teacher, our role is to really self-reflect and really think about and be how are we being explicit about the impact that power has between with our different relationships in amongst class and in our society and in our communities. Okay. So another thing is a lot of times people talk about like, okay, well, what does this actually do? What have we seen ethnic studies do? Well, in Christine Sleater's work, some of the major outcomes of ethnic studies curriculum for students of color, we see academic engagement, we see academic achievement, and we see personal empowerment. Because with ethnic studies, students of color are being treated like they are intellectually capable, right? And that their academic, and I talked a little bit about this earlier, their academic identities are connected to their ethnic identities. It's not in conflict with it, right? So when we center our students' cultural identities, our students are now seen as insiders. They have prior knowledge, they have problem solving. That is value. It has value and it's useful. We can use it for academic learning. It reflects students' lived experiences, like with racism or poverty. So students are equipped with tools to now be able to understand what they're living through and be able to do something about it. So now we are able to help students see that they can have a sense of participation and hope. And then it also really exposes the depth and the richness of our own American ethnic history and culture, right? So a lot of times what communities of color experience is like, oh, well, I'm outside of this American experience. But now we get to question our own identities and our experiences and claim that as American. So what my uncle, he wasn't just an immigrant experiencing those things. No, that is an American identity. That is our American identity. And there's also outcomes for white students. What do we see when white students when they have access to ethnic studies? They are able to have racial attitudes that are acquired actively, right? So, for example, they get exposed to diversity experiences, like they get to learn about racism, but also how to challenge it. They have these experiences through taking classes, and they get these experiences through interracial interaction, right? So, interacting with communities that have white students and students of color. And so what they saw is it led to learning how racism affects everyone and that we can have a vision to address it and improve racial attitudes among white children, significant gains in empathy, higher levels of thinking, and positive impacts on democratic outcomes. Okay. And so a lot of times there's in the academic world, there's like, okay, well, where are the where's the where's the where are the numbers? Let's talk about the quantitative outcomes. All these studies are qualitative. Where are the quantitative? Well, Dee and Penner did a quantitative study, and they were able to find causal evidence when there is efficacy with ethnic studies within a school district. And so, with their study, what they did is they had about 1,400 ninth graders. They came from different cohorts in San Francisco Unified, and they were encouraged to enroll in a pilot ethnic studies course. And they were identified due to being in danger of dropping out because their eighth grade GPA was below a 2.0. And so what they found when they did this with fidelity, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, was they saw that when students that from these groups participated in the ethnic studies course, they had improved attendance by 21 points, percentage points. They improved their ninth grade GPA by 1.4 grade points, and they increased their credits that they've earned by 23 credits. This is important. And so what this helps show is that a culturally relevant curriculum implemented in a strongly supportive context, and I'm going to get to this again, can be highly effective at improving outcomes among diverse groups of academically at-risk students. So, other theoretical mechanisms that could have been happening as this experience being culturally responsive pedagogy, which is the idea of which is promoting a sense of belongingness in school, is forewarning about stereotypes, affirming our community values, and being able to have external attribution for experiencing challenges, right? So it's not your fault that you're going through these things. Being able to understand like, oh, okay, there are other things that are contributing to these these barriers that I'm experiencing. And so this was a year-long course, and because it was year-long, experiencing and understanding these ideas were it created a more intense and persistent experience. So a key thing here that we it's really important to know is this study they found they were able to see that these outcomes because there was high fidelity and forethought and planning across the whole district when they implemented this. For example, they had a core group of teachers who were engaged in a regular professional learning community about ethnic studies, and they had support from experts in ethnic studies in their subjects to help them create and sustain the program. So it wasn't like, oh, you got the credential, go ahead, have fun. It wasn't that. It was, no, no, we're going to have a community where you all continuously engage with this. We're going to bring in experts that are going to support you with this process. And so that high fidelity was is really key when when we talk about what leads to these types of successful outcomes. Okay. And so looking back when I was a high school teacher, now a school site administrator and formerly in another a district leader in another school setting. I'm looking back and what helped me when I was a teacher, right? So as a school leader, we got to think about, well, the teachers are who actually they're on the boots on the ground, right? We are on the teachers are on the ground working with the students and the community. So how do we help the teachers? And so what helped me was being able to connect with communities who are authentically doing the work, not just coming up with a project to, send something to an elected official, connecting with people who are doing the work. So, for example, when I was in the classroom, I was able to connect with Patrice Cullors, who is working with the Coalition to End Sheriff Violence in LA County Jails. And we were able to connect our government curriculum with what's actually happening in the community. And so when you have these community partnerships, we're able to see great things happen. So here, this was an image of one of the projects we did in my classroom where the students helped organize a community town hall and had County Board of Supervisors, Margaret Lee Thomas, actually come to the community and address the community to talk about their community. So this was out in South LA, but these experiences that communities and families and even our own students were experiencing with sheriff violence in LA County jails. And some of the work that the students produced was these interactive pieces, being able to look at some of these key texts and really beautifully helping the community engage with it, right? And this was from reports filed against the sheriff's department. Um, and again, more student work here. And so thinking about that as a school leader, How do we support this process? And it really goes back to Paulo Freire's work of praxis. How do we make sure that we are in dialogue, naming the things that we see in the world, posing the problems we're seeing, and then starting to have that shared language that is so that we can name it now. It's not just something that we experience, it's not something we just accept, but we know we can call it out. It has a name, and then be able to investigate that, and then be able to think about, well, what's the new thing we can do? What is that? What could we do? And let's call that, let's give that a name. And as we go through that process, being able to act on that work and transforming the world. So it's really that process of being in dialogue, being able to learn what's going on in our communities and coming up with ideas of what we can do. And that's what ethnic studies can look like across all disciplines. This is not just relegated to a social studies class. This is something that can happen in science classes, in math classes, right? These are things that we can investigate in across the curriculum. And so as we think about how that looks like, I want to bring up Bree Picower's work on the elements of social justice in really, I know it says elementary classroom, but really it's about just this curriculum design, right? And she does a lot of great work talking about this, but I'm just going to share just really quickly that the key elements and what we need to consider. Key element one is self-love and knowledge. How do we build a sense of pride in who we are and deconstructing these negative stereotypes? Number two, so the next component is how do we build respect for others, right? So that beyond like, oh, here's a hero and here's a holiday, but really think about how do we have that respect for others and then looking at social injustice, but being careful to not just stop there because a lot of times that's when students can feel helpless, right? And this is where even my own example there was having that support to be able to build that community partnership, right? And looking at how we can work with folks who are doing that work so we don't feel disempowered. Next is social movements and social change. Starting here can lead to an incomplete understanding of what we're fighting against. And we have to be careful of projects that are rooted in charity, like just giving things, but really think about like how do we also do that and start to talk about what are the structures that are creating these conditions, and then raising awareness. And another consideration is, well, how do we make sure we don't just stop here because even just stopping here might actually lead to a false sense of completion and we're not really addressing what's going on. And so, and then the final component is social action, which is really what are the skills we need to create change and have an impact in our communities in ways that are relevant. Okay? And I'm going to just end with this final piece here about what ethnic studies is and what it is not. So, ethnic studies, it is not teaching students to hate white people. What ethnic studies is, it's a safe space for healing those things that our communities have experienced and making sense of that and being able to have a process to name the pain and the realities of white supremacies and the feelings that we may have of resentment. And ethnic studies is not divisive. It is inclusive of a multicultural American curriculum. There's a lot of experiences, right? And it's about creating a narrative that supports and develops cross-group communication, right? It's about us being able to communicate with each other and being able to have an intersectional analysis, right? Amongst different levels of power. Ethnic studies is not un-American. Ethnic studies is not teaching racial separatism. It is not about teaching the overthrow of the US government. It is about preparing students to succeed and that we can interrogate these dominant ideas of power while embracing our ethnic identities at the same time. And ethnic studies is not non-academic and touchy-feely. It is academically based, designed to improve student academic performance and provide university preparation. And ethnic studies is not a substitute for academic knowledge and skills. Ethnic studies is a movement for curricular and pedagogical projects that reclaim marginalized voices and histories tied to social action that challenges and transforms oppressive systems and cultures of domination. And so back to that, it's just a that was just a teaser of what's to come. So I hope that this was a good intro for the ideas of what ethnic studies is and how it can promote equity. And in my session, we'll be talking about what we can do as school leaders to support our communities and our students through ethnic studies. Thank you.